The courtroom was already full before the session officially began. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of attorneys, reporters, defendants' families, and curious observers. The air felt dense, charged with anticipation. It was a high-profile fraud case involving a well-known local developer, and media coverage had drawn more attention than usual. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but journalists filled the back row, notepads ready. At the front of the room, Judge Harold Whitmore sat behind the elevated bench, reviewing documents with practiced detachment. To his right, Court Clerk Maria Denson organized files into neat stacks, her movements efficient and precise. The seal of the court loomed large behind them, a silent reminder of the authority governing the room. Near the main aisle stood Officer Ryan Keller, the courtroom's assigned security officer. Keller took his role seriously, perhaps too seriously. His uniform was pressed sharply, badge polished to a shine. His posture was rigid, chin slightly raised as he scanned the room with narrow eyes. He had built a reputation for being strict. No whisper went unchecked. No movement unnoticed. "Phones off," he said sharply as two college students slipped into the back row. "If I hear a vibration, you're out." They nodded quickly. Keller didn't smile. He rarely did. Midway down the second row sat a man who didn't fit the restless energy of the room. Early 40s, dark suit, clean shave, calm posture. His name was Ethan Cole. Unlike most spectators, Ethan wasn't whispering, scrolling, or shifting nervously. He sat upright, hands loosely folded in his lap, observing everything with quiet attention. His gaze moved deliberately from the bench to the attorneys' tables, to the security positioning near the doors. He looked less like a spectator, and more like someone studying the system. Keller noticed him, almost immediately. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about Ethan. No sudden movements, no disruption. But there was something about his composure that stood out. In a room full of tension and nerves, Ethan looked entirely at ease. The courtroom doors opened again, and a late-arriving attorney rushed in, briefcase in hand. "You're cutting it close," Keller muttered as the attorney hurried past. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and tapped his microphone. "Court is now in session." The room stood. Ethan rose with everyone else, smooth, controlled, unhurried. When the room sat back down, Keller remained standing near the aisle, arms crossed loosely in front of him. His eyes scanned again, stopping briefly on Ethan. Ethan met his gaze for a moment, not confrontational, not submissive, just steady. Keller looked away first. The prosecution began outlining preliminary motions. Papers shuffled, pens scratched against legal pads. A low whisper rose from the back row before Keller shot a glare in that direction, silencing it instantly. Order mattered to him. Control mattered. As the hearing progressed, a minor delay occurred when a document wasn't immediately available. Judge Whitmore requested a short pause while the clerk located the file. The room's discipline loosened slightly. Murmurs returned. Ethan leaned subtly toward the aisle and spoke quietly to Clerk Maria Denson, asking a brief procedural question in a respectful tone. It was calm, measured, but Keller heard it, and his head turned sharply. The first ripple of tension had just begun. The murmur in the courtroom was soft, almost harmless, but to Officer Ryan Keller, it was a crack in discipline. He stepped forward, boots striking the polished floor with deliberate weight. His presence alone was usually enough to silence most disruptions. He stopped beside Ethan Cole, his shadow stretching across the bench. "You don't speak unless addressed," Keller said quietly but firmly. "This isn't a coffee shop." Ethan turned his head slowly, maintaining the same composed expression. "I was asking the clerk a procedural question during recess," he replied, voice calm and even. No disrespect intended. Keller didn't like the tone, not because it was rude, but because it wasn't intimidated. "You'll address the bench if you have questions," Keller said, "or you'll remain silent." Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. The exchange wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. Reporters in the back subtly leaned forward. Ethan gave a slight nod. Understood. That should have ended it. But something about the interaction lingered with Keller. He felt watched by the crowd, by the attorneys, maybe even by the judge. His authority in this room was clear. He enforced order. He maintained structure. And he didn't like the idea of anyone quietly bending that structure, even in small ways. He stepped back, but didn't fully retreat. His eyes stayed on Ethan longer than necessary. At the bench, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "We will resume." The hearing continued. The prosecutor called attention to a disputed financial statement. Defense counsel objected. Legal arguments began to heat up. Voices sharpened slightly, though still within courtroom decorum. Ethan observed carefully. He took no notes. He didn't whisper again. He simply watched, occasionally adjusting his cuff or shifting slightly in his seat. Keller's attention kept drifting back to him. It wasn't Ethan's behavior. It was his composure. Most spectators in high-profile cases showed visible emotion, interest, anxiety, frustration. Ethan displayed none of it. He looked like someone evaluating performance. During another brief pause, Ethan reached inside his suit jacket. Keller reacted instantly. "Hands where I can see them," Keller snapped, stepping forward. The room stiffened. Ethan froze mid-motion, then slowly withdrew a leather identification holder but didn't open it. "It's just my ID," Ethan said evenly. "I was adjusting it." Keller's jaw tightened. "Keep it visible." Ethan placed both hands on his lap again. A few attorneys exchanged glances. The tension was no longer subtle. It had weight now. Judge Whitmore looked down from the bench. "Officer Keller, is there an issue?" "No, Your Honor," Keller replied without breaking eye contact with Ethan. But there was an issue, and everyone could feel it. The hearing proceeded, but the dynamic had shifted. The courtroom's attention was now split between the legal battle at the front and the silent standoff in the second row. Ethan remained composed. Keller remained alert. Neither man backed down. And though no one knew it yet, the balance of power in that room was far more fragile than it appeared. The tension in the courtroom no longer felt subtle. It had become something tangible, like static in the air before a storm. Arguments between the prosecution and defense intensified. Objections overlapped. Judge Whitmore's gavel struck twice to restore order. But even as legal voices clashed at the front of the room, a quieter confrontation was brewing in the second row. Officer Ryan Keller had stopped pretending not to watch Ethan Cole. Every small movement, every shift of posture, every adjustment of his suit caught Keller's attention. To him, Ethan's calmness no longer felt neutral. It felt deliberate, challenging. Midway through a heated exchange over financial records, Ethan leaned slightly forward again. His expression remained composed, but this time he turned his head toward the defense table as if trying to hear more clearly. That was enough. "Sit back," Keller ordered sharply. Ethan slowly leaned into his seat. "I am sitting back, then stay that way." A few people in the gallery glanced over, their curiosity no longer hidden. One reporter subtly scribbled something in a notebook. Judge Whitmore looked up briefly, but returned to the case discussion. Minutes passed. The prosecution requested a short sidebar conference. The judge agreed, and white noise filled the courtroom speakers while the attorneys approached the bench. The room relaxed slightly. Conversations began in hushed tones. Ethan shifted again this time, pulling out his phone, screen dark. Before he could even unlock it, Keller was in front of him. "I said no phones," Keller snapped. "It's off," Ethan replied calmly, holding up the blank screen. "You think I'm blind?" "No, officer. I think you're mistaken." That word mistaken landed wrong. Keller reached down and grabbed Ethan's wrist, not violently, but firmly enough to draw attention. "You don't instruct me in my courtroom." Ethan's expression finally changed, but not to fear. It was disappointment, "Remove your hand," he said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. For a brief second, neither man moved. Then Keller, reacting more to the room than to Ethan, tightened his grip and pulled him to his feet. Gasps spread across the benches. "That's enough," Keller said. "You're disrupting proceedings." "I have done nothing disruptive," Ethan replied, now standing tall but not resisting. The attorneys at the bench turned around. Judge Whitmore's voice cut through the white noise. "Officer Keller, what is happening?" Before Keller could respond, Ethan calmly reached into his inner jacket pocket again, slowly this time, and withdrew the leather identification holder he had started to reveal earlier. He flipped it open. The courtroom went silent. Keller's grip loosened as his eyes scanned the badge and credentials inside. The seal was unmistakable. The name was unmistakable. Ethan Cole wasn't just a spectator. He was Chief Judge Ethan Cole of the Federal Circuit, present to observe procedural conduct following an anonymous complaint about courtroom behavior. And every eye in the room was now on Officer Ryan Keller. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Even the low hum of the courtroom's ventilation system seemed louder than usual. Officer Ryan Keller's hand slowly dropped from Ethan Cole's wrist as the leather identification remained open between them. Chief Judge, Federal Circuit. The gold seal reflected under the courtroom lights. Keller blinked once, as if his eyes needed to confirm what they were seeing. His posture, once rigid with authority, faltered slightly. The confidence that had filled his stance only minutes ago now looked uncertain. Behind him, whispers began soft at first, then spreading like ripples across water. Judge Whitmore stood from the bench. "Approach," he ordered, voice tight. But this time, it wasn't directed at attorneys. It was directed at Keller. Ethan calmly closed his ID holder and adjusted his jacket. His expression remained controlled, but there was no arrogance in it, only measured disappointment. "I was here as an observer," Ethan said evenly, projecting just enough for the room to hear. "Following reports regarding excessive enforcement of authority during open proceedings." The words felt like a quiet verdict. Keller's face drained of color. I was maintaining order," he said, but the strength in his voice was gone. Judge Whitmore stepped down from the bench, an unusual move that instantly shifted the gravity of the situation. The courtroom had transformed from a place of public judgment into a stage of accountability. "Officer Keller," Whitmore said carefully, "you will release the individual and step aside immediately." "I've already released him, Your Honor." The correction sounded defensive. Ethan turned slightly, addressing the bench rather than Keller. "No physical injury," he stated calmly, but the escalation was unnecessary. Reporters were no longer pretending to take notes discreetly. Pens moved rapidly. One of them glanced toward the door, likely calculating how quickly this story would spread. Keller became aware of the audience in a way he never had before. The same crowd he once controlled now watched him evaluating him. Control had shifted. Whitmore's voice lowered. "Chief Judge Cole, I was unaware of your presence." "That was intentional," Ethan replied. "It allows authentic observation." The implication hung heavily. Authentic observation. Meaning, no preparation, no performance. Just reality. The courtroom doors opened quietly as two additional court officers entered, responding to the visible tension. They paused, uncertain, reading the room. Whitmore nodded toward Keller. "Step outside. Now." Keller hesitated just long enough to make it noticeable, then turned toward the aisle. As he walked past the benches, the same spectators who had once avoided eye contact now watched openly. He reached the door, paused briefly, then exited. The door closed with a muted click. Inside, the energy had completely transformed. What began as a routine hearing had become something far more significant. Ethan adjusted his cuffs once more, composed as ever. "I believe," he said calmly, "we should continue." But nothing in that courtroom would continue the same way again. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds after Officer Keller exited. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion but from realization. Judge Whitmore slowly returned to the bench, adjusting his robe as if restoring order to himself before restoring it to the room. His earlier authority now carried a different weight. This was no longer just about a fraud case. It was about institutional conduct. Chief Judge Ethan Cole remained standing briefly, scanning the room not with dominance, but with awareness. Every attorney, every reporter, every spectator now understood they had witnessed something rare, unchecked authority being challenged in real time. Whitmore cleared his throat. For the record, he began carefully, the court acknowledges the presence of Chief Judge Ethan Cole of the Federal Circuit. The words formalized what everyone already knew. A court reporter typed rapidly, fingers moving like machinery. Ethan gave a slight nod. "I am here in an observational capacity only," he said. "This proceeding may continue." Whitmore studied him for a moment. "And the matter involving Officer Keller?" "That matter," Ethan replied evenly, "will be addressed administratively. Transparency will be maintained." The statement was calm but decisive. In the back row, one reporter quietly slipped out of the room, phone already in hand. The story was too significant to wait. Whitmore resumed the fraud hearing, but the rhythm was altered. Attorneys chose their words more carefully. The defense attorney, previously animated, now spoke with deliberate precision. The prosecution followed suit. Even minor objections carried a new layer of caution. Everyone had just been reminded that oversight was real. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Officer Keller stood in the hallway near a marble column. 2 internal affairs officers had arrived and were speaking to him in low, controlled tones. His shoulders, once squared with pride, now sagged slightly. "This is standard procedure," one of the officers told him. "We'll need your statement." Keller nodded stiffly. Inside, Ethan finally took a seat, but this time closer to the aisle, fully visible, not hidden among spectators, not anonymous. He didn't interrupt again. He didn't move unnecessarily. He simply observed. But the power dynamic had permanently shifted. After another 30 minutes, Judge Whitmore called a brief recess. This time, the room emptied slowly, cautiously. Attorneys whispered about policy reviews. Court staff exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere was no longer charged with drama. It was heavy with consequence. Whitmore stepped down and approached Ethan directly. "You could have identified yourself immediately," Whitmore said quietly. "I could have," Ethan agreed, "but that would have altered behavior." Whitmore sighed. "And now?" "Now," Ethan replied. "Behavior will alter on its own." There was no threat in his voice, only certainty. Outside the tall courthouse windows, late afternoon light filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Inside, something larger than a single incident had begun. Not a scandal, not a spectacle. A correction. By the time recess ended, the courthouse no longer felt routine. Whispers had traveled faster than any official statement. Clerks in distant offices were already speculating. 2 local news vans had quietly parked across the street. What happened inside that courtroom was no longer contained within its walls. Officer Ryan Keller sat in a small administrative office on the 2nd floor, his uniform jacket folded neatly over the back of a chair. Across from him sat Lieutenant Mark Reyes from Internal Affairs, a tablet resting on his lap. "This isn't about embarrassment," Reyes said evenly. "It's about conduct." Keller's jaw tightened. "I was maintaining order. You escalated a situation involving a seated observer who was not disruptive." He reached into his jacket. "In my position, that's a risk." Reyes nodded once. "And once you saw identification?" Keller hesitated. "I reacted based on protocol." The hesitation spoke louder than the answer. Meanwhile, downstairs, Chief Judge Ethan Cole remained in the courtroom as proceedings resumed. The fraud case moved forward, but the emotional temperature had cooled. Attorneys were sharper. Objections were more measured. No one wanted to be the next example of excessive force or overreach. Ethan observed without expression, occasionally jotting brief notes in a slim black notebook. Not accusation. Not judgments. Observation. At the bench, Judge Whitmore maintained strict control, but there was a subtle humility in his tone now. He paused longer before ruling on objections. He ensured each party was heard fully. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. When the hearing adjourned for the day, Whitmore requested a private meeting with Ethan in chambers. The room behind the courtroom was quieter, more intimate. Law books lined the walls, their leather spines worn with use. Whitmore removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "I won't defend what happened," Whitmore began. "But I will say this courthouse handles high-tension cases weakly. Security can become rigid." "Rigid is not the issue," Ethan replied calmly. "Imbalance is." Whitmore leaned back slightly. "You believe this is systemic?" "I believe," Ethan said carefully, "that authority without accountability becomes habit." The statement lingered in the air. Outside the building, Keller exited through a side door. Reporters were waiting. "Officer Keller, any comment? Was excessive force used? Were you aware of Chief Judge Cole's presence?" Flashes from cameras reflected off the courthouse steps. Keller said nothing. Inside, Internal Affairs began reviewing security footage from multiple angles. The video showed everything: the wrist grab, the tension, the identification reveal. Frame by frame, the story looked different than Keller had described it. Back in chambers, Whitmore nodded slowly. "What happens next?" "A formal review," Ethan answered. "Not just of one officer, but of courtroom conduct policies." Whitmore absorbed that. "And Keller?" "That depends on what the review reveals." As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused near the door. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about correction." Down the hallway, staff members straightened as he passed. The courthouse stood the same as it had that morning: solid stone, polished floors, towering columns. But inside, the system was shifting, quietly, deliberately, and permanently. By the following morning, the incident was no longer confined to courthouse conversations. Local headlines ran before sunrise. "Courtroom confrontation raises questions about security conduct." Though no dramatic footage had been released publicly, anonymous sources confirmed enough details to fuel intense debate. Legal analysts on morning broadcasts discussed courtroom authority. Comment sections flooded with divided opinions, some defending strict security enforcement, others condemning unnecessary escalation. Officer Ryan Keller sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at his silent phone. He had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending review. The uniform that once symbolized pride now hung untouched in his closet. Across town, Chief Judge Ethan Cole prepared for a scheduled policy meeting at the Federal Circuit Administrative Office. He didn't watch the news. He didn't read the headlines. His focus remained forward. Inside the courthouse, tension lingered. Staff members were more formal than usual. Conversations stopped when supervisors approached. Security officers stood straighter, spoke softer, observed more carefully. The ripple effect had begun. Judge Whitmore called an internal meeting with courtroom personnel. "This is not about blame," he stated firmly. "This is about evaluation." A projector displayed still images from the security footage. The room watched quietly as the moment of escalation replayed. The wrist grab, the sharp verbal exchange, the reveal of identification. No one defended it, but no one openly condemned it either. It was more complicated than that. "We operate under pressure," one deputy said carefully. "Threats are real, and so is perception," Whitmore replied. "Public trust is part of courtroom safety." Meanwhile, Internal Affairs interviewed spectators who had been seated near Ethan. Their accounts were consistent. No raised voice from Ethan. No visible disruption. Calm compliance until physical contact occurred. The narrative was solidifying. Later that afternoon, Keller was summoned for a formal review hearing. He entered a neutral conference room. No badges, no public benches, no elevated bench of authority. Just a long table. Across from him sat Lieutenant Reyes and 2 oversight representatives. "You've served 12 years without major complaint," Reyes began, "but this incident reflects a pattern of excessive assertiveness noted in prior minor reports." Keller looked down briefly. "I enforce rules." "Yes," one representative replied. "But enforcement requires judgment." Silence filled the room. For the first time since the incident, Keller didn't defend himself immediately. "I didn't intend harm," he said quietly. "Intent and impact differ," Reyes responded. At the same hour, Ethan met with federal oversight officials to discuss broader courtroom conduct standards. He presented measured recommendations: de-escalation training, periodic behavioral audits, anonymous reporting channels for courtroom staff. Not punishment, reform. Back at the courthouse, the day ended more quietly than usual. Staff members left with thoughtful expressions. Security officers double-checked procedures not out of fear, but awareness. As evening settled, the courthouse stood illuminated under fading light. Inside those walls, something fundamental had shifted. Authority had been tested, and accountability had answered. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next morning. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scratching of pens replaced the tension that had previously crackled like static. Every individual present, attorneys, clerks, reporters, even spectators, was acutely aware of the event that had unfolded the previous day. The slap, the shocked gasps, the reveal it had become the unspoken pivot point for the entire courthouse staff. Chief Judge Ethan Cole arrived early, as was his routine. He moved with measured steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the marble floors. His presence carried authority, but unlike the sharp assertiveness of Officer Ryan Keller, it was calm, understated, and inherently commanding. He wasn't there to dominate. He was there to observe, to guide, and to ensure order within the system he had sworn to uphold. He paused at the entrance to the courtroom, letting his gaze sweep the rows of seats and tables. Eyes subtly followed him, some wide with lingering disbelief, others respectful, acknowledging the quiet weight of his position. Today, his presence was no longer anonymous. The courthouse now recognized that the man who had been silent, composed, and seemingly ordinary the day before was in fact the Chief Judge of the Federal Circuit. In the back row, reporters murmured quietly, typing notes into laptops or dictating summaries into recorders. The story was spreading fast, not just as gossip, but as a discussion about protocol, authority, and proper courtroom conduct. Ethan paid no attention to the reporters. He focused on the staff, clerks, security, attorneys. His observations were precise, professional, and without personal judgment. Each action, each hesitation, each subtle misstep by others was catalogued internally not for punishment, but to identify weaknesses in procedure that needed correction. Meanwhile, Officer Keller remained on administrative leave, but the reverberations of his actions were impossible to ignore. In hallways, staff members exchanged whispers. Attorneys approached the bench more cautiously. Security officers checked and rechecked their procedures, now aware that a single overstep could be publicly scrutinized and institutionally reprimanded. The dynamic in the courthouse had shifted irreversibly. Authority was no longer assumed, it was earned and accountable. During a brief recess, Ethan spoke with Judge Whitmore in chambers. Their discussion was calm, focused on systemic solutions. The previous incident, Whitmore began, has highlighted gaps in oversight. It cannot happen again." Ethan nodded, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "This is not about one officer," he said. "It's about ensuring every courtroom participant understands their responsibility. Enforcement must be balanced with discretion, and authority must respect protocol." As the day continued, each courtroom interaction reflected the subtle influence of the previous day's events. Attorneys moderated their tone. Security officers maintained vigilance, but avoided unnecessary confrontation. The presence of Chief Judge Cole served as a quiet reminder that discipline, composure, and institutional authority could shift the balance without a single raised voice. By the end of the session, it was clear the reveal had transformed the courthouse environment. The slap and subsequent identification were no longer isolated incidents. They had become the catalyst for change. The staff understood that authority, unchecked or misapplied, would not go unnoticed. And in that realization, Ethan Cole's quiet, deliberate presence reinforced the fundamental lesson. True power is exercised through composure, oversight, and unwavering professionalism. By mid-morning, the courthouse had settled into a tentative rhythm. The staff, attorneys, and spectators moved with a cautious awareness, each step measured, each interaction deliberate. The previous day's events were no longer just a story, they were a lesson, unfolding in real time under the watchful presence of Chief Judge Ethan Cole. Officer Ryan Keller, meanwhile, was confined to a small review office. His uniform lay neatly on a chair, untouched. He sat rigidly, hands clasped, as Lieutenant Mark Reyes and 2 internal affairs investigators prepared to conduct a formal debrief. The gravity of the situation had finally reached him. What once seemed like routine enforcement now appeared as an egregious error. "You understand why you're here?" Reyes asked calmly, though his tone carried unmistakable authority. Keller swallowed hard. "Yes, I overstepped, but my intent was to maintain order." "Intent and impact differ significantly," one investigator replied, flipping through notes. "Your actions disrupted a federal observer and violated established protocols. The identity of Chief Judge Cole only underscores the severity of the situation." Keller's shoulders slumped slightly. The badge he wore for years, the symbol of his authority, now felt like a weight pressing him into his chair. The recognition that his control was not absolute was a new and uncomfortable reality. Meanwhile, in the main courtroom, Ethan Cole observed the continuation of the fraud case. He remained composed, taking notes silently and scanning every movement of the courtroom staff. Security officers moved more carefully, conscious that any misstep could result in further scrutiny. Attorneys moderated their tone, hesitant to provoke unnecessary tension. The courtroom's energy had shifted. The balance of power was no longer theoretical, it was visible and unmistakable. Back in the review office, Keller answered questions methodically but cautiously. Every statement he made would be documented, reviewed, and considered in determining consequences. The realization that his authority could collapse so completely in public weighed heavily on him. It wasn't fear of punishment alone, it was the knowledge that his professional judgment had been questioned, and that public scrutiny would follow. Ethan's influence extended beyond presence. His calm, deliberate authority had created a ripple effect, changing behavior throughout the courthouse without a single overt action. Staff members were more attentive, procedures more closely followed, and accountability taken more seriously. The lesson was clear. Authority is fragile when untempered by restraint and respect. Later that afternoon, the Internal Affairs report was summarized for Judge Whitmore. The findings highlighted both Keller's prior exemplary record and the need for immediate corrective action, including formal reprimand and mandatory retraining in de-escalation and courtroom procedure. The review emphasized systemic improvement rather than mere punishment, a chance to prevent recurrence. Ethan observed quietly as these decisions were discussed. His role was not punitive, but corrective. The collapse of Keller's perceived power had not been a spectacle for spectacle's sake. It had been a demonstration of accountability in action. By the end of the day, Keller left the building quietly, escorted by senior officers. He understood, fully, that the illusion of authority could collapse in an instant if not exercised with discipline, judgment, and respect for the system. The lesson had been irreversible. The courthouse, once routine and procedural, had transformed. Its hierarchy was intact, but the fragility of assumed power had been made abundantly clear. And above it all, Chief Judge Ethan Cole remained a silent, unshakable presence, a reminder that true authority is measured not by force, but by composure, foresight, and unwavering professionalism. The following day, the courthouse operated under an unusually meticulous order. Every staff member seemed aware of the previous incident's ramifications. Security officers walked the halls with a heightened sense of awareness, double-checking procedures and ensuring that no unnecessary confrontations occurred. Every clerk, attorney, and court personnel moved with deliberate precision, as if the echoes of the slap still resonated in the marble walls. Officer Ryan Keller had been formally summoned to the Internal Affairs Office for a comprehensive review. His uniform remained neatly folded on a chair, the badge glinting under fluorescent lights, a symbol that now carried less authority and more scrutiny. Lieutenant Mark Reyes and 2 oversight officials were present, tablets and files at the ready. The formal review was not a casual discussion. It was an institutional reckoning. "Officer Keller," Reyes began, voice neutral but firm, "your actions yesterday escalated beyond standard protocol." Keller swallowed, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. "I was maintaining order," he said, almost reflexively. "Maintaining order requires judgment," one of the oversight officers responded. The escalation involved physical contact with a court observer who had not displayed any disruptive behavior. Moreover, the individual's identity as Chief Judge Ethan Cole amplifies the severity of the situation. Keller shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the precision of the words. Authority, once instinctively commanded by his badge, now felt conditional and fragile. The realization hit him fully. Institutional oversight existed, and it was not lenient. Simultaneously, in the main courtroom, Chief Judge Ethan Cole continued observing proceedings. He didn't participate, didn't interfere, yet his presence was felt in the deliberate way attorneys chose their words, the measured restraint of the security officers, and the quieter, more precise movement of the clerks. His authority, unlike Keller's, required no display of force. It commanded respect simply through the acknowledgement of its weight. Back in the Internal Affairs Office, the review proceeded with methodical precision. Keller answered questions, clarified his intentions, and acknowledged missteps. Every answer, every hesitation, every word would be documented for evaluation by the Oversight Board. The officers in the room noted patterns both of Keller's previously commendable service record and of his lapses in judgment. The goal was not punishment alone, it was systemic correction. By mid-afternoon, the report was drafted, detailing a formal reprimand, mandatory de-escalation and courtroom conduct retraining, and a review of security protocols. Keller was made aware that further incidents of this nature would have severe professional consequences. The action plan was both corrective and preventive, designed to reinforce accountability and restore trust in courtroom enforcement procedures. Meanwhile, Chief Judge Cole convened a brief meeting with Judge Whitmore and senior clerks. They discussed potential improvements, clearer boundaries for security, observer protocols, and reporting procedures for any future incidents. Every recommendation was practical, measured, and focused on maintaining integrity without unnecessarily escalating authority. By the end of the day, the institutional consequences had set a clear precedent. Authority was not absolute. Oversight existed, accountability was real, and procedural discipline was mandatory. Officer Keller had learned the fragility of assumed power, and the courthouse staff understood that order could not rely on ego alone. Chief Judge Ethan Cole left the building quietly, his presence having shifted the culture of the courthouse without a word of confrontation. True authority, he demonstrated, was not enforced through fear or impulsive force. It was earned, measured, and maintained with composure, insight, and unwavering professionalism. By the time the next session of the courthouse began, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Staff members moved with careful precision. Security officers were alert but composed, no longer aggressive or reactionary. Attorneys chose their words deliberately, measured in tone and pace. Observers, once inattentive, now followed proceedings with heightened awareness. The events of the previous day had left an indelible mark on the courtroom, and everyone was keenly aware of it. Chief Judge Ethan Cole took his place near the gallery. Unlike Officer Keller, he did not rely on uniform or badge to command attention. Instead, his authority emanated from composure and reputation. As the hearing commenced, he observed silently, taking meticulous notes on the courtroom dynamics, how security interacted with the public, how attorneys responded to interruptions, and how clerks maintained procedural flow. During a brief recess, Judge Whitmore invited Ethan to speak to the courtroom staff in a controlled, professional setting. The staff gathered in the main chamber, chairs forming a semicircle. Ethan's demeanor was calm, confident, and deliberate, every movement purposeful. He began without raising his voice. The events of yesterday were unprecedented. Ethan started, his tone even, but they serve as an opportunity. Authority is not measured by strength, uniform, or impulsive action. It is measured by judgment, restraint, and adherence to protocol. Murmurs of acknowledgement passed through the room. Some staff nodded quietly, realizing the lesson embedded in his words. Every officer, clerk, and courtroom participant has a role in maintaining order, he continued. That order must never come at the expense of fairness or professionalism. Physical escalation should always be a last resort. Every action taken here reflects not just on you as an individual, but on the integrity of the institution. He paused, allowing the words to settle. Silence followed, but it was respectful silence, not fearful. Ethan then addressed Officer Keller directly, though the officer was seated several feet away. Your intentions may have been to enforce order, he said, but the impact demonstrated the need for reflection and correction. Training, oversight, and accountability exist to prevent such situations. It is not punishment for its own sake, but guidance to strengthen the system. The clarity and impartiality in Ethan's voice removed any notion of personal vendetta. There was no dramatization, no theatrical display, just professional authority, rooted in fairness and institutional respect. He concluded by emphasizing the larger lesson. True authority is exercised responsibly. It is acknowledged through composure and earned through consistent professionalism. Let this incident be a reminder. Power without discipline is fragile. Respect without structure is fleeting. As Ethan stepped away, the courtroom felt transformed. Staff members returned to their stations with renewed focus. Security officers maintained vigilance, but their interactions were measured and deliberate. Attorneys, clerks, and even spectators were subtly influenced by the calm yet undeniable authority that Ethan projected. The courtroom had returned to function, but it was no longer the same environment. The events of the previous day, combined with Ethan's professional address, had permanently reshaped the culture within those walls. Authority and accountability were now clearly aligned, and the lesson had been delivered without a single act of confrontation. In that quiet transformation, Ethan Cole demonstrated the enduring power of professionalism, composure, and unwavering dedication to the principles of justice. By late afternoon, the courthouse had regained its routine rhythm, but the atmosphere carried a new awareness. The events of the previous week, the slap, the reveal, the formal review, and Chief Judge Ethan Cole's professional address had permanently altered the courthouse dynamic. Staff moved with precision, security officers acted with discretion, and attorneys and clerks were more deliberate in their actions. The lessons were internalized. Authority must be exercised responsibly, and accountability is non-negotiable. Officer Ryan Keller's final meeting with Internal Affairs concluded quietly. He had accepted the formal reprimand, acknowledged his lapse in judgment, and agreed to mandatory de-escalation and courtroom conduct training. The officers emphasized that the purpose was corrective, not punitive. "This is about restoring trust," Lieutenant Mark Reyes explained, "and ensuring that every participant understands the limits and responsibilities of authority." Keller nodded, understanding for the first time that his badge alone could not shield him from consequence. Meanwhile, Chief Judge Ethan Cole prepared to leave the courthouse for the day. He had spent hours observing proceedings, reviewing documentation, and consulting with Judge Whitmore on procedural improvements. His role had been deliberate, to ensure systemic accountability without drama or spectacle. He moved through the halls with measured steps, nodding subtly to staff members who met his gaze with respect. No one interfered with him, and yet his presence alone ensured that order and professionalism were maintained. The courtroom itself had transformed. Where once routine proceedings might have been conducted with passive compliance, there was now active mindfulness. Attorneys moderated their tone. Clerks processed documents with more precision. Security officers, including those who had not been directly involved in the incident, demonstrated restraint and vigilance. The subtle shift was noticeable even to outside observers. The courthouse's culture had been recalibrated. Before leaving, Ethan paused at the main courtroom doors, looking back at the polished benches and the elevated judge's seat. The chamber had been the site of a dramatic reversal of authority, but now it symbolized something greater, the proper alignment of power with accountability. The staff had witnessed firsthand the consequences of misapplied authority, and the importance of measured professionalism had been cemented. As he exited, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long, warm reflections across the marble floor. The scene was symbolic, almost cinematic. The physical structure of the courthouse remained the same, but the internal structure, the balance of respect, authority, and accountability had shifted irrevocably. Keller remained behind briefly to collect his belongings. Though humbled, he carried with him a new understanding. Authority is not innate. It is earned through composure, judgment, and respect for institutional procedures. Mistakes do not define power. Response and correction do. Outside, reporters waited, but Ethan declined comment. His influence was not for headlines, it was for systemic integrity. As the courthouse doors closed behind him, the lesson remained visible. Real authority is measured not by immediate compliance or fear, but by restraint, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to justice. The ripple effect of one composed, decisive figure had transformed the environment permanently. The building stood quiet under the late afternoon sun, a monument to law, order, and the subtle yet powerful force of ethical authority. Inside, staff continued their work with renewed diligence, understanding that true power is exercised responsibly, observed attentively, and respected universally. And with that, Chief Judge Ethan Cole's presence faded from immediate view, but the impact of his intervention and the lesson it imparted would endure far beyond that single courtroom.